Hey guys, so we're picking back up here on March 17th, and we kind of took a day off yesterday to take a step back and reevaluate kind of what's the best way to put it? Kind of the procedure that we were and the process that we were going to follow and continuing on in this series. So the goal of this has been to pick up skills relating to programming in the most efficient way possible. So learning the things that are actually useful in the real world on the job, while skipping things that maybe get conventionally taught in academic settings, but really don't have a lot of real world value. So that's kind of been the focus of our series here. We've been learning the programming language Python and some of the basic programming skills in that. So loops, conditionals, functions, things like that. Thus far, we haven't really gotten to object-oriented programming yet, or anonymous classes and Lambda expressions and some of the other more advanced programming concepts. And we will get to those eventually. But in this process, we took a step back yesterday and we're kind of reevaluating some of the way in which we were doing this. So thus far, I have kind of just been teaching kind of on an ad hoc basis, making things up as we go along here. And that served us okay, especially for the more basic bits. But now that we're getting into kind of a larger example, and we're also just kind of maybe perhaps moving into more advanced topics, and also just because it's probably better overall, I've decided to try to make things a little bit more formal here. So we're going to try to add a little bit of structure, also do more rigorous assignments. So not so much just me sitting here and talking, but also have more like assigned homework and also tests of a sort, although of course this isn't a formal class. So all of that is going to hopefully add some structure here. And so with that in mind, even if we don't have very much on the slides, planning on doing slides here. So first thing that we're going to do today, we're going to go over some of the practice problems that I had assigned for us yesterday. And you can tell me after that, if you want to go through all of the problems that we did yesterday, even though you may not have finished them all, we can do that. Or perhaps we'll just do the ones that you've worked on and we'll leave the other ones as exercises for today. And then after that, we would go on and try to continue fleshing out the error handling for the CRUD functions in our storefront application. So those would be the goals for today. And so in terms of where you got, so yesterday afternoon, so that would be yesterday night for you, I went through and added some problems here that I think are around the skill level where we are. I said up here that if you don't know how to do something, you should immediately Google it, right? So we're trying to get in the habit of figuring out how to do things based on searching on the internet. So if we get stuck on something, trying to fix our own problems by looking things up and reading how to do it ourselves. So the first function we had here, I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on it as long as you feel like you understand it, right? So that would be...
I tried to see if I could do it with a while loop or with conditionals, and either way, it didn't seem to work very well.
So this right here, this is how I'd intended to have you do it. So basically, there's a function that tries to convert the input to a float, right? A floating point number. And if it's possible, this won't throw an error. And if it's not possible, it'll throw an error. And I'm assuming you looked this up and the error that it throws is a value error if it's not possible. And so you catch the value error and then you return false. So this is exactly how it makes sense to do this one. So in this particular function, we actually don't really care what the value is that they enter. We just want to make sure that it is a valid floating point number. So do you have any questions on this?
No, I think it's all clear. I just wanted to make sure that when I tried the while loop and the conditional, the fact that it didn't work was because it wasn't supposed to work.
Well, I would have to see exactly what you had tried, but this was indeed the way that I had been thinking of basically what this problem would be doing, using the try and the except with a specific error type to check if what the user had entered was valid. That was kind of what I was aiming to have this problem get at. So, all right. So it looks like this is where you kind of stopped. So presumably working on this one for a while here. This exercise was relating to verifying, this one was tricky because it's going to involve multiple tables. And that's something that we hadn't done so much here. But I think we had all the tools necessary from the past examples that we've been working on in our storefront application dealing with the CSV files. I think you had everything you needed here to actually do this one. Now, of course, it's harder than you think because, well, just because we've done some things, well, we haven't done this exact thing before, right? So it always seems kind of unfair. I know in high school, we always complained when our physics teacher would be like, you know, he would always throw new things at us on tests. And we'd be like, well, how's that fair? You know, like you're supposed to test us on the things that we went over in class. And he was like, well, in the real world, you know, the problems aren't just going to nicely arrange themselves as to things you've actually done, right? And we were all like, yeah. But, and then we did really bad on the test. So yeah, I can sympathize, but it's true. In a development environment, your problems aren't just going to neatly arrange themselves into things that you've already done and that you've already seen before. And so you're going to have to figure out how to do things on the fly. Okay, so this one, the problem was we're going to have a function here called store has valid store owner, and it's going to take in the name of a store as a string. And what this function was supposed to do was given our already existing CSV file. So we had a CSV file for customers and for stores and for store owners. At least those are the ones that we focused on so far. We want to take in the name of a store and verify that the foreign key ID value for the store owner of that store actually exists in the store owners table. So return true if so, false otherwise. So I'll start off by asking if what this function is supposed to do makes sense.
Yes, it made sense to me. I understood what I was supposed to do there.
So first we're going to go check the stores file. And, you know, I'm going to wave my hand a little bit here in terms of how we actually do this in code. But first we're going to check the stores file, and we need to find the store owner ID here. And having found the store owner ID, we want to go to the store owners table and then check to make sure that there is actually a row of that ID in this table, right? So that's at a high level what we would want to do in this function here. One sec, logging in over on my other computer. So that was basically the gist of this. And so step one is getting the store owner ID from this table. Step two is going in the store owners table and making sure that that row exists, basically. So not intended to be, you know, horrifically challenging, but certainly going to require us to understand how to open and read from CSV files. But we're not actually writing anything to any of the files this time, but we do need to read from more than one. So at some point, maybe I'll want to not paste in the answer directly here. You know, I actually wrote this just like 20 minutes ago or something, right before we started here, having seen how far you've gotten here. I'm intending to actually write solutions for all the problems I give you. That way we can just immediately go over it. I don't have to figure it out on the fly either. But today, kind of just doing the ones that you did. So I'll go ahead and write solutions for these two, probably tonight or something. But for this one, we'll go ahead and start out by looking at what it is you were trying to do. So why don't you go ahead and see if you can try to explain it to me, what your thought process was in this.
Okay. So I thought, first of all, I should open the stores file. Okay, I obviously also took the function for reading the field names. So I thought I should open the stores file and then open the store owners file separately, like two different files. Then for a row in the stores file, okay, what I wanted to do here was, once you verify that the name in the stores file is the store name that we're checking out, then this print store name was actually supposed to debug. I wanted to figure out where the program was not working. Then field names for read was to pull out the rows and the values essentially to know what is what. Then I identified the specific value I was looking for in there, in the row foreign key ID, that's line 44. Did the same thing with the ID for the store owner's file. Then I tried to compare the two to ask, is the foreign key ID the same as the ID for the store owners? If they were the same, then the application was supposed to return, the function was supposed to return true. If not, it was supposed to return false.
Mm-hmm.
What I was trying to do. I'm not really sure if I got
Okay.
I think I got some of it. Yeah.
Let's start out with the question here of whether we want to be using the function to grab the field names. Do you think that we're going to want to be using the ones for read or the one that gets all the field names here? Do you remember what the difference between them was when we were using them here? We had two functions here. We had one that was just get field names generally, right? And then we had one for get field names for read, right? And if you look in our read function here, we start out by using the ones for all of the field names, right? This was our loop where we were validating it the other day. And so we're starting out with all the field names here. And then we actually only get the field names for read when we're trying to basically print stuff. So we don't actually use the field names for read when we're looping through the records in a CSV file. We're only using it to determine what we print out to the user. And so in what we're doing here, which function do you think we're going to want to be using?
Obviously the general one. I completely that. Yes.
Okay.
So that was why I added in a foreign key.
1 point. So we'll start with that, right? So we'll replace the field names one that you had with the one that gets all the field names here. And what doesn't I like about this?
Indentation.
Expected indent, huh?
The def.
It's probably, we have a space there. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, okay, one error here. Let's just go through line by line. So now we're going to be using the get field names function. We'll go fix that when we get the field names. But step one, so line 32, we have a red squiggle here. This red squiggle says this. Now, if you go and you compare where we open up the CSV files in the storefront application file, let me come find one. Actually, I'm not sure if we are opening up one. I mean, so here's an example line where we're opening one, right?
Okay, I see. I missed the R there.
Okay, so that's one thing for sure. But I was actually going to start with something a little bit earlier on the line. What do you notice about the first argument? What data type is the first argument going to be?
It's a string.
Okay, and so we come over here and see, right now, you don't have it as a string. So that's one thing we can fix here. Okay, and then we do need to tell it how we want to be opening it. And so if you remember, thus far, we've used 3 different flags. We've used read, write, and append. Do you want to try to explain to me what the difference between those 3 things is?
Read essentially sort of extracts the information in the file, the data in the file. Write puts data in the file, and append. Oh, that one is, I think I'm not sure what that one does now.
Okay. So write actually writes stuff from the very beginning of the file. Append just writes stuff to the very end of the file. So when you open a file for writing, you basically start out with the blank file and you write to it as if it's a new thing. With append, you're going to take what already exists in the file and you're just going to add to it. So if you just want to stick one more row on the end of the file, that's when you'd use append. But here, this particular function, all we care about is reading. So we're just going to call read. Okay, and so you properly saw here, we're not passing in table name. We're assuming the table names here of stores and store owners. So now these lines look okay here. So this may be a little bit confusing. I'm not sure how much we actually explained this, but if we go and we look inside the other functions where we've been opening files to do stuff with reading, let's go look at read in our storefront application here. Let's delete. Suppose it doesn't really matter which one we do. But relative to this with statement here, right, this line, what level of indentation is the loop at where we're going through things in the file?
The for loop, is that what you mean?
Right. So we're looping through the rows in the file, right?
Yes. It was just one level down from with statement. Oh, right. Okay. I see that now.
So let me briefly try to explain what the with statement does. So when your program is trying to access this file's on your computer, right? And so this function right here, this method is called open. And what it does is it basically says, hey, file system, computers have file systems, right? Different kinds of operating systems have different kinds of file systems. We're not going to care about that. Basically, your program is saying, hey, operating system, I want to access this file. Okay. And then the operating says, okay, sure, here you go. Here's the file. But then when you're done with it, you want your program to free up the file again, right? It's as if it like took it out of storage. And once it's done, you want to put it back in storage, because if you don't put it back in storage, no one else can use it, right? Or you just constantly pull more and more things out of storage, and then suddenly you don't have any more space left. And that means you run out of memory on your computer. So I don't want to get too technical in how computer programs actually execute at the operating system level, but basically, most of the time, if you open a file, you want to also close it. And what the with keyword does for us right here is it says everything that is indented in from this, right? Everything that is inside of this block, we're going to do while this file is open. And then as soon as we leave this block, so as soon as we're in the indentation level here, you see how this is level with that width? Okay. As soon as we get outside the block, we're going to close this file.
Close the file. So the file is closed at this point. That's what it means.
So at line 34, this file won't even be open anymore. And then same thing with line 37 here. As soon as we get back level with this block, this is going to open it and it's going to say, okay, I want to do these things inside the block with this file open. And as soon as we get outside of it, the file is going to be closed again. So hopefully you can kind of see why everything you're doing here, well, the files aren't even open, right? Now we have another problem even before that. So when we're building the readers, so we're using the CSV library, right? And so for one thing, this error that you're getting here saying undefined name, we need to make sure that we actually just go import the package here. So you see up here, we have a statement. I probably haven't been real clear about this, but when you're using other libraries and stuff, you have to tell Python, hey, I want to use this thing. I want to use this module. I think it's typically what they're called. Although I don't know if Python calls them that. Package module, whatever. I want to use this thing. And this thing, if we do CSV dot whatever, we can get functions, right? And so here you see CSV dot dict reader. Okay, so this is a method of the CSV package or module. And this thing takes in two arguments. The first thing it does is it takes in the name of the file that we're going to be doing here, right? And so we do that here. So we're going to open this thing as a file, and then we're going to give it the file, right? And the second thing it takes in is a list containing field names. And then it's going to open it up as a dictionary, which with each field name mapped to the value from the CSV file, right? We've used this before in our other methods. And so you see how we have a red squiggle here now? This red squiggle says undefined name field names. So can you tell me why we're getting this error here?
Okay, I hope I'll be able to say that clearly. I think it's because it really doesn't match any like what's happening in the get field names, it's not actually matching them to any values in the file. I don't know if I'm right about that.
So when we have something that is on the right-hand side of an equal sign, do you remember what we call that?
Yes, it's a value you're matching, you're assigning to the left-hand side.
The variable assignment, right? And so whatever we're assigning to the variable has to have a value, right?
Yes.
So some things are values in and of themselves, like a string. You can always assign something to be a string because this is itself a value. But if we assign one variable to another variable, the variable that we are assigning it to, it has to have a value, right? And so remember how we've talked about function scope? And so right now we are inside of this function called store has valid store owner, right? We're inside this function scope. So before we execute this line here on line 35, does the variable called field names, does it have a value?
No, it doesn't, not at this point. We actually given it one.
And so if we go back and we look at our other functions here, so for example, let's look at read, right? Before we open the file, we're going to get the field names, right? And in delete down here, before we open the file, we're going to grab the field names, right?
Yes.
And so when we do this here, where we assign the field names inside of the dict reader method to be the value that we have here, by the point in which we do this on line 153 here, we've already defined field names. Field names get a value up here on line 149. Okay. So if we go back to where you were here, before we can open this file here, we need to get a value for field names. So we need to do something like field names equals. Now what should go here? So this first read, we're looking at the stores CSV file, right?
Yes. So I'm saying I'm expecting get field names with stores in it in the what's the word? There's the thing in the parentheses will be stored.
The argument list.
The arguments,
Okay, right. So we're going to set field names equal to stores. Okay, so up until here, we're doing fine now. So as far as I can see, up to line 37 here, now we've got what we need. So the first thing we're going to do in this function is we're going to grab field names for the stores table. We're going to open the stores CSV file. We're going to call the file when we open it CSV_file, and we're going to build a reader for this file using the dict reader method of the CSV library. And we're going to pass in this file we've just opened and the field names that we just got. So all of that makes sense to you so far?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so do you remember how I said at a high level, what we want to do here is first thing we want to do is grab the foreign key ID value for the store owner from the stores table. That was step one. And then step two is making sure it actually exists in the store owners table, right?
Yes.
So what you were doing in your application was you were trying to open both files at the same time. So what was your logic behind doing that? Like, do you think
my thinking was
both open or?
Yes, my thinking was that I could have both files open and pick one value from the other and compare it to the other. So if given what you've explained to me right now, what I would have done is actually write with open storeowners.csv and everything indented under the first one.
So you think that we should just indent that, right?
Yeah, that's what I would do. But I'm also suspecting that what you might actually do is just pull out the store owner ID from first file.
So the program itself, it won't like fail to run if we have more than one file open at the same time. I mean, if you were to open thousands of files at once, that would cause problems, but 2 files open at once is not going to cause issues. But the question is, do we want to do it or not? Is it necessary to do it? So you had said that perhaps we grab the value from one file and then we compare it to the other file. Now, from the computer's point of view, once we've grabbed the value from the file, do you think we need the first file open anymore?
No.
Or can we release it, right? Because we can save the value to a variable. And once the value is in a variable, we don't care about the file, right?
Yeah.
So actually, I would say that the best way to do this is to do it in two separate calls. So the first part, if we were to name the section of this function, so we would say first, we want to grab store owner foreign key ID. Okay, that's going to be this first bit. And then the second thing we're going to do is second, we want to make sure store owner exists, right?
Yes.
Okay. So you tell me how you want to proceed here. Do you first want to completely finish the first part, or do you want to get the second part set up properly, just like opening the file for the first part? Because one problem that you're going to have here, if you were to nest these completely, so if we were to stay nested how you had initially done it, is that this variable here that you have called CSV underscore file up here, you're using the same variable here, right?
Yes, that's true.
And so you would probably want to name that something different.
Yeah.
But given that we're going to keep them separate for now, we'll just ignore this bottom part and we'll try to finish out the first part. Okay, so now that you understand, hopefully, how the with line works here, right? So we're going to open this file, and then everything that's inside of this block we're going to do with this file open. And then as soon as we leave the block, the program will automatically close this file for us, right?
Yes.
So do we want to be looping through rows with the file open or with the file closed?
With the file open, that's
because logically we can't actually grab a row from the file if the file isn't open, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's copy your initial thing down here. So we have right here, indent this properly, and well, it's actually not indented properly. Interesting. Okay, so after having gotten the CSV reader stores, okay, so we've gotten a CSV reader for the stored CSV file. We're going to go through all the rows in the CSV reader, and if the row name is equal to the store name, what is the first thing that we wanted to do here? So printing, this was probably you trying to debug, right?
Yes, it was.
Okay, but what is the thing that we want to grab here?
We want to grab the foreign key ID.
So I would probably actually call this store owner ID because foreign key is kind of general. You can have foreign keys to multiple things, but here specifically what we're interested in is the store owner ID. Okay, so what do we set store owner ID equal to?
Store owner ID. I mean, that's what it's also called in the file.
So you're saying just this?
Yeah. I mean, I thought the first one would be row, then store owner ID. Well, I'm not really sure.
So like this?
No, I meant that for the left-hand side, actually.
So this is the value coming from the file, right? That's what row store owner ID represents. Now we want to be grabbing the value from the file, and we want to be saving it somewhere else. So to make this clear, what I would do is I would actually make this much more explicit. I would set a variable up here and say, you know what, we're going to start out and we're going to say store owner ID is a blank string, right? We haven't gotten it yet. And then we're going to grab the field names, then we're going to open the file, then we're going to set up the CSV file reader, then we're going to go through all the rows. And if the row name matches the store name that we're interested in here, then we're going to set this variable that we've declared up here. This variable is part of the scope here for this function called store has valid store owner. So as part of this function's local scope, then we're going to set this variable equal to the value that we're reading out of this particular row in the CSV store reader file. that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so this was the first part. Do you want me to go through it again, or do you think you're good on how all the logic works here to grab the store owner ID outside of the stores.csv file?
I think I do, but I would appreciate it if you went through it again, just so
Okay.
make sure I'm not missing anything.
So this was what we had said was step number 1 in our process here. So our problem was, given the already existing CSV files, we wanted to take in the name of a store, and then we wanted to verify that the foreign key ID value for the store owner of that store, so the thing that was linking this store to the store owners table, we wanted to make sure that that actually existed in the store owners table. So what that means is that the store owner that we're saying is the person who owns the store. We want to make sure that they actually exist. And so we want to return true if they do actually exist, and then we want to return false otherwise. So in this process, logically speaking, the first thing that we need to do is we need to figure out what ID the store owner that we're supposed to be checking here, what ID they have. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go find the store by name. We're going to give us a store name, and we need to go find that store by name. And we need to figure out which store owner is supposed to own that store, right? And we're going to know which store owner they are by their ID that we're tracking here, their so-called foreign key ID, which means that the stores table is related to the store owners table. So the stores table references a record in the store owners table because a store owner owns a store, right? Okay, so the first thing we need to do then is grab the foreign key ID value for store owner from the specific row in the stores table that we're interested in. And what row are we interested in? We're interested in the one where we match the name, right?
Yes.
And so having gotten that ID, after that, we're going to want to go in the store owners table, so different CSV file, and then we're going to want to make sure that the person we're saying owns the store actually exists. That's step 2. We haven't done that yet. But everything that we already did was step 1, getting the store owner ID from the stores table here. So we copied this function over from what we'd already done in the other file, where we're setting up this function here that gets the names of a fields based on the table name that we pass in, right? So first, we're dealing with the stores table. That's why we pass in the table name here of stores. So in this function here, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a local variable called store owner ID, and we're going to set it equal to the empty string, right? So this is the value we want to get here. You don't technically have to declare this. It might be considered good practice too, because to someone reading your code, they're going to say, okay, we're going to have this variable, and we're going to set it equal to a default value here. We haven't gotten it yet. And then when they come down here and they see, okay, now we're going to grab the store owner ID, right? So now we're going to give this variable we declared up here, we're going to give it a value. But before that, we need to get the field names for the stores table using the function that we wrote here. And after we get the field names, we open the stores CSV file for reading. That's what the R flag here does. And we're going to open it with the name CSV_file. And so what this thing represents here is that this is a variable that represents the file that we're opening here. So basically, this with statement that we're doing here, it's kind of as if we're saying CSV file is going to be equal to what this thing returns here. It's kind of like we're doing that, except it's within the context of this with block here.
Okay.
All right, so CSV file represents this file here that we're opening for reading. And then on the next line, we're going to set up our CSV reader by calling the CSV packages dict reader function. And that takes in the file that we've opened here. And it also takes in a list that contains the field names. And so right here, just above, we had gotten the field names from this other function here that returns a list. And so here, specifically for stores, we've gotten the list that contains 3 values, ID, name, and store owner ID, right? And so when we pass this method here, this variable containing the list of field names, we're saying, hey, I'm opening the CSV file that I have here, and we should have 3 comma separated values on each row. The first one is going to represent ID. The second one is going to represent name, and the third one is going to represent store owner ID. And having made this CSV file reader, then we've defined what our data source is and what the format of the data is. That's what those two parameters do. Then we're going to go through every row in the file that we've opened here by iterating over the CSV file reader. And then we're going to check if the name of the row is equal to the store name that we are passing in here. So that is the input parameter to the function here. So we want to check if the row name in the file is equal to the store name. And then once we found the store that we're interested in, so once we found the store whose name matches, we're going to go ahead and set the variable that we had declared up here. We're going to set its value to be equal to the value of the store owner ID field in that row. So that's why we're indexing into the row variable here. This row right here represents a dictionary. If you remember, that's why this is called the dict reader. So dictionaries are indexed by keys. And this is the key that we're indexing into this dictionary with. The key is called store owner ID, and it's going to be mapped to this specific row's value for the store owner ID. So the third field here in the row.
Okay.
All right. So
all of it makes sense.
After all this, now we've gotten the store owner foreign key ID. So now we're going to do part 2, right? So now we need to open the store owner CSV file, right? Because the next step is we want to make sure that this guy actually exists, the store owner that we're saying we have here. Okay, so with open store owners.csv for reading as CSV file. Now, this variable was used up here, but now we're outside of this with block. It's actually okay for us to use this variable again if you want to, because we're not inside of a place where this variable is defined. We don't actually care. We can reuse it. It doesn't really matter too much. So it's kind of up to you.
Yes, I would rather reuse it.
Okay.
And
so now tell me, do you think that everything here, does this all look fine to you, right? So we don't have any red squiggles, right? But just because we don't have red squiggles doesn't necessarily mean that the logic is right. So I'll give you a hint that there is something wrong logically with this line right here, and see if you can spot it.
Okay, 1 second then.
And I would suggest you just go thing by thing. So this is the left-hand side of the assignment operation, which is just a variable name, right?
Yes.
We don't care. Variable name doesn't need to be defined yet, so that's fine, right?
Yes, but there's something missing. There's a line missing, but that's not what you're referring to. You're talking about this specific line.
What do you mean there's a line missing?
We haven't fetched the field names for
Good. So that was what I wanted you to see. And so when we do this assignment here, and we're saying field names, the field names that we're passing into this dictionary reader for this file, what is the value that we're going to be setting this equal to?
Yes, we don't have that.
Well, I mean, actually, we have a value for it, but what value is it?
Okay. It would be using the same values we used earlier for the first file.
So remember, we gotten the field names up here, up above in our function, right? And the field names, when we got them up above, we got them for stores. But are we opening the stores table anymore? So this line is taking in a store owner's file, right?
Yes.
And so the stores field names are here, ID name, store owner ID. The store owners have ID name, username, password, assets, and liabilities. So if we tell the program, hey, I'm going to open this new file and it has these fields in each row, I mean, the program is going to look at us and be like, what the heck, man? Because you're saying it has 3 values when in fact it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 values, right? So this field names that we're passing right here, this isn't the right thing. So if you want to see an actual example of this stores, this is right. So ID, name, and then store owner ID, those are the 3 fields here. But if we go look at store owners, ID, name, username, password, assets, liabilities, right? So trying to map that onto the other one is just not going to work. And so we can actually reuse, there's no reason why we need to use another variable name. We can use the same variable name. It's just before we call this again, we need to make sure that what's in the field names variable is actually the right thing. So
yes,
what should I set the field names variable equal to here?
get field names store owners.
Okay, get field names store owners. Store underscore owners. Right. And now when we make this call, we're going to assign field names, the variable that we've defined here, to be equal to whatever this method returns. And this method returns ID, name, username, password, assets, liabilities, right? And
yes,
those are the right field names for when we are dealing with data in the store owners file. So store owners do in fact have those fields. Okay, so now if we come back here in our application, now when we're opening this second CSV reader here, we're passing it this file, CSV underscore file, which we defined here as being the store owner CSV file. We're opening it for reading, and we're saying that the field names are equal to the new field names that we just got, which are the field names for the store owners table, right?
yes.
Okay, so everything thus far looks good to me. So what do we want to do now? So the first part was we wanted to grab the store owner foreign key ID. And then the second thing was, this is what we're trying to do here. We want to make sure the store owner actually exists. So how are we going to do that?
Yeah, we will actually compare the store owner ID, or yes, that's ID we grabbed. We will check to see if it's in this file.
Okay, so that is correct logically, but what do I write code-wise to make it do that?
Okay, so if we'll look through the rows.
Okay, so for row in, and what are we looping through here?
CSV reader store owners.
Okay, CSV reader store owners. Okay, store owners, right?
So if store owner ID equals IB, I guess. Am I right about that?
So if we write this, Python thinks this is a variable, right?
Right. So ID is not defined. So how would I define that? Define it the same way you did
what
here.
Values are we wanting to compare against, right? We want to be checking if this ID that we have, we want to be checking if it exists where? Think about it. We want to check if it's existing in the file, right?
In the file, yeah. So if row ID,
if
row ID,
row
yes,
index with ID, okay.
Yes. Do we say if row equals, do we just say row ID equals ID?
You mean ID or?
Sorry?
So first off, is it single equals or double equals?
Well, if it's a conditional, it will have to be, but I don't think it should be a conditional, right? I'm thinking that what we want to do is to, we want to do an assignment. So I would actually say ID is equal to row ID, something like that. So
do we want to do an assignment? So what is this function supposed to return here? It's supposed to return true if the person exists in the row and false otherwise.
Yes.
So if we do an assignment, we're updating the row data, right?
Okay.
Do we want to be updating the row data?
No, we don't. Okay, so we could do if row ID equals store owner ID.
Okay. So I want you to tell me why this is correct, because it is correct, but I want you to explain it to me.
Okay, so okay, I think I get what's happening now. So it will look through the row and look for the value of ID. and try to check each ID that it goes through against this store owner ID, which we already have.
Mm-hmm.
So if it finds one that matches, it will return a value.
Okay.
So return true
Right.
here.
So when we go through all the rows, the conditional that we're checking is we're going to check the ID field in each row, and we want to compare it against the store owner ID that we already have. And if we do find it, what do we want to return?
True.
True. Okay. And then if we get to the outside of this file, so we've gone through all the rows and we haven't yet returned true, what does that mean?
We return false.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Because the store owner ID doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Because we've gone through this whole file and the ID that we were interested in, we've decided it doesn't actually exist in the store owners table, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you want to try it? So
Yes.
to test this function, we want to try, so we can print whatever we return here. So we want to test store as valid store owner, and or the store name here, let's comment out. Well, I guess you already had it. Yeah. So like that, right?
Yeah.
And we would expect this to do what? So if we look at stores, we have Ariel's baked goods is pointing to store owner record number 1, because store owner record number 1, and that represents to Ariel Manson. So we would expect this to return true, right?
Yes.
All right, so let's go ahead and run it, and it returns true. Okay, so now this function, we want to test it. What happens if we have the store name here, but the ID for the store name, let's go ahead and change the stores file. So you see, for store owners, we only have 2 store owners right now. So let's say that we give this the store owner ID of 3. So right now we don't have a store owner with ID 3 here. So we're saying this store is assigned to the person in the store owners table with ID 3. Right now there is no person like that. So what would we expect our function to return now?
Expect it to return false.
Right, and it would return false because first we go through, we grab the store ID. So we get the store owner ID, fine, we get the store owner ID is 3. And we're going to go through each one of the rows here in the store owners table. So we're going to go through the first row and we're going to see, okay, the ID is 1. Because 1 is not equal to 3, we're not going to return true. We're going to go on the second iteration. Because 2 is not equal to 3, we're not going to return true. And then we're going to exit the loop because there's no more rows, right? And so once we've exited the loop, that means we're right here on this line. We've jumped out of the loop, we're done. Looking through this file, we've decided, okay, there isn't anything, and that means we're going to return false here on line 52. Okay, so we're going to run this. We're going to return false, right? Okay, so it looks like our function is working. Now let me tell you something. What happens if the user gives us a store that doesn't exist? Let's say they misspelled it, right? What's going to happen now?
Okay, I actually thought there might be an error or something.
But just because it doesn't throw an error doesn't mean that what we're doing is the right thing, right? So I'll show you what I did when I wrote this function. So in fact, this should look very similar to what we just did here, right? So you see, I defined store owner ID. I got the field names. This part right here is exactly what you have, okay? Like literally no different. But I stuck an if statement in between the 2 loops. This bit that you have down here, exactly what you have too, right? See, this should look really, really familiar, right? This is exactly what we just did. So the only thing that's different is this right here. And see if you can tell me what this right here is going to do. Well, actually, don't read that. Don't cheat.
It actually catches an exception is what I was thinking. It makes sure that the store name that's entered actually exists. If it doesn't exist, the user is told to, at least we warn him that that store name doesn't exist. So it's supposed to catch an exception situation.
Now, I wouldn't quite phrase it as catch an exception because we're not actually throwing, no exception is thrown here. There is no error. So if we were to use the word, catch an exception, we would have to use a try except block, right?
Okay.
And we're not actually using a try except block. All we're doing is we're checking a specific state. So once we get done reading the stuff in this first file, we should never actually finish getting through this file without assigning a value to store owner ID unless the store name doesn't exist, right?
Yes.
So if we check right here, if we check the value of store owner ID and we haven't set it equal to anything, that means that it hasn't been modified since we first made this variable up here. And if it hasn't been modified, that means that there was no store containing store name, because if there was, it would have a value for this, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that's what this represents. We didn't actually throw any errors. We're not catching any errors here.
Okay.
But as you said, if the store doesn't exist, we want to tell the user such and we want to return false. Because if the store doesn't exist, obviously we can't say that the store has a valid store owner, right?
Yes.
Now we could also throw an exception here. If we wanted to throw our own exception, that would be possible too. But here I just decided to tell the user and then return false. So
Okay.
let's
Okay,
go and add
understand.
this to your code up here, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we've added it to your code. We can get rid of mine. I mean, you saw my code was basically exactly the same thing we just did, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now we want to test this, and now we want to see if an error message prints, right?
Yes.
Store has valid store owner, because now we misspelled the word baked, and so see, there is no store named Ariel's baked without an E goods. But if we add the E back, given the fact that right now we set the store owner ID here to be 3, and there is no store owner with ID 3, we still expect this to return false, but now it's going to return false without the message, right? Because
Yes.
there was a store called Ariel's Baked Goods. It's just the store owner that we said owned that store doesn't actually exist, right?
Yes. Okay.
And so to be even more precise, we might want to actually add another message down here, right? So if we're returning false, we could say there is no store owner with the ID assigned to, and then maybe we are descriptive when we use the store name. So before we just returned false, we didn't say anything. But now when we run it, we'll say that there is no store owner with the ID assigned to Ariel's Baked Goods, right?
Yes. Yes.
And now if the user gets a false, now they know why. Now they know why they got a false. So either they get a false because the store that we're checking, doesn't exist, right? That's one reason to get a false. Or they get a false because the store we're checking exists, but there is no store owner with the ID assigned to the store. Or the other possibility, the correct branch here, is that there actually is someone assigned to the store, right?
Yes.
And everything matches.
Yes. Okay. So all of that makes sense to me now.
So you want me to go over anything again, or do you think you got this one now?
There's something I want to go through out so I make sure it sticks, because it's a little woozy in my head. This bit in the second block of code, or rather the second major block of code, for row in CSV reader store owners, if row ID equal to store owner ID. So I think the thing that made this a bit difficult for me was that I was always trying to match what we did earlier in other functions that we wrote when we actually listed out the various rows. So what is happening here is we're looping through each of those rows. Okay. So we're looping through each of those rows and looking for a value in those rows that matches the store owner ID that we have. And we're specifically looking through a particular dictionary entry, is that the word? Mm-hmm. So we're not just looking at like name, username, and all that stuff. We're looking at the IDs.
Mm-hmm.
Thing here, we're just narrowing it down, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's great.
So we don't care about the other values here, but
Yes.
we do want to give our dictionary reader the correct value so that it knows what each one of the fields is, though. That's why we're getting the field names when we open them to read here.
Yes. Okay.
So you see this function here, see, starts on line 33, goes to like line 58. Not super short, right?
Yeah.
But what helps, you see how we have comments here, right? So first do this. If this doesn't exist, here's what it means. And after all that, we do this, right? Commenting your code like this, very helpful because it helps you know what each thing's supposed to do, right?
Yes.
And so if you break it down, this function really shouldn't be that bad, right? It's mostly just doing the same sorts of things that we've already done in our other applications here in our storefront application, except, you know, doing things in a slightly different way with a slightly different purpose, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now we've gotten through the ones that you've started. What do you want to continue doing for the rest of our time together here? Do you want to?
Anything else? I want to tackle the rest of the problems on my own.
Okay, so we said on our agenda for today that the other thing that we were going to do was continue to flesh out the error handling for our CRUD functions. So this would be in the main application here. Okay, so for the time being, I'm going to go ahead because this framework depends on us having stuff in the main Python function to run. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of the stuff that we had moved out into a separate file. I'm going to put it back. And I just moved the stuff that we were working on here. And when we finish today, I'll move all this back to the main function. And then you can just keep going on these practice problems down here. So the one for authenticating the user, and then the one for checking if the input values that they entered are equal to the correct length based on the names here in this dictionary. And the last one is returning a hashed password. So if the user gives you a password, you want to hash it so that we can store a hash value in the database or our data, database emulator here rather than their password in plain text. So all three of these things are actually things we might actually want to use. So I tried to come up with like functions that are like actually useful rather than just, really lame, like examples that like no one would actually ever use. So all of these things might actually be something that we would want to use in our application, right? All right, so those are the three that we have left. We'll just leave those as exercises. So you can keep going and trying those. I may not actually give you more. I think I'll just leave you with these three tonight. So I probably won't come up with more problems, although I'll come ready to work through these with you tomorrow as well. Okay, so that's our practice problems. But now when we come back, we want to pick up still doing validation on some of our functions here. So my goodness, I think we decided we copy pasted everything up towards the top for the stuff that we needed to do, right? So we did one of these together. I think we'd done validation in read, right? And I'm not sure how much else you had done on your own, right?
No, I don't think I've done any other validation. I don't remember doing it.
All right, so let's do delete next then. So the first thing that we have been trying to do, or actually, let's just keep going with read, right? Because so we've done table name now. We validated the table name, and we did that by writing this while loop here. We said while get field names of the table name is none. We want them. We're going to print the fact that they don't have a valid table name. We're going to ask them to keep entering a table name until they get the right one, right? But I said, if you recall, I think at the end of yesterday when we were talking here that it's not that I said the wrong thing, but we probably don't really want to validate ID quite the same way because someone who's using our system, they're probably really not going to know ID, right? So if you see over here in the practice problem that we just wrote, I didn't say, the user is going to pass in an ID. I said they're going to pass in a store name because that's what humans think in terms of, right?
Yes.
So if we ask the user, the ID you entered isn't valid, please enter a valid ID. The user is going to be like, what's an ID? You know, like, what does that mean? So in our application, IDs should be completely transparent to them. The user never even needs to know that we have IDs associated with anything, right? In fact, it's kind of a security risk if you let people know that, because then you're giving away something about your database. It's considered like bad practice security wise. So to the user, they don't need to know that there even is an ID, right? So for this purpose, so the first thing, we'll let them know maybe they entered a table name that isn't valid, right? So for IDs, I don't know. I mean, multiple things we could do here, but I mean, so how would we check if the ID is valid anyway, right? Just think about it for a second. For this read function, what we're trying to do is we're trying to go through all the records in the table represented by table name, and we want to spit back stuff relating to the record that has ID equal to the ID that we're passing in. So what does it mean for this particular function to have an invalid ID?
If it has an invalid ID, then it won't have any records. There'll be no records for it to access.
So will this if statement ever be true if it doesn't have a valid ID?
It will never be true.
And so you see, if this if statement is true, what we do is we grab the record that we're supposed to return and then we return it, right?
Yes.
So what happens if we put code down here? So when we get to code down here, so if I put something down here, what has happened in the program if I ever reach this place on line 105?
If you get there, it means that there were no records, so it's invalid, right? Yes.
Because if we get here, it means that the ID that they passed in like basically doesn't exist in their database, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so we can start with that. We can just say print record requested does exist, right? That is reasonably descriptive. But we actually have something that could be wrong with ID even before we get there. So remember how we've had recurring bugs when we've been working on things because I keep forgetting to pass in the ID as a string, right?
Yes, that's true.
I think we'd want to catch that too, right? And we can actually do that before we do anything else. So we're validating the table name here. But if they give us a bogus ID, right, we might want to check that first. So how do you think we want to check if the value they gave us is a string or not, right? Because we only want to continue on in this function if it is a string.
So we would write a while loop again, but this time we're checking to see if it's a string, if they passed in a string. But wouldn't we be trying to convert whatever they pass into a string? And if we can't, then we tell them that they have to enter it again.
So that's a possibility. We could try to automatically do it, but I think it's probably better to tell them that what they passed in wasn't valid, right? Because if we just automatically do it, I mean, like they technically were like doing things behind the scenes that they're not aware of. I mean, I suppose that's okay, but so where I was going with this is, well, I mean, off the top of my head, so we want to see how to check if something is a Python, right? Check if a variable is a string. Sounds like what we want, right? So there's a function called isInstance. We take in a variable name and we give it a type, right?
Okay.
So
the same thing for the floating point data type you mentioned before, because it seemed like the only way I could do it was actually to try to convert what the user entered into a.
Yeah, we can go back and rewrite that one in this way. There's multiple ways to actually do that. You're correct that this is relevant there as well. So let's handle the case that we're looking at right here. So we want to say handle the case the user passes in something other than string, right?
Yes.
Okay. So given that, what we would want to check is if what the user passes in is not a string. So if we check here, I mean, there's multiple ways. You see, we could use this function here, call it is instance of, or just is instance, right? That's one way. Or we could use another function called type and check to see if it's equal to a string. Personally, I think this is kind of easier to read, right? Like easier to understand.
Yeah.
So let's use that one. I mean, either one is fine, but so we want to check if the type of the variable that we have ID here is equal to string. In fact, what we want to check if it's not equal to a string, we want to print. The, well, what should we say?
The ID
of the record you provide must be string value. Yeah, something like that, right?
Yes.
And then, you know, there technically we could actually throw an error here, right? That is something we can do. We just a keyword called throw that lets us define our own error if we want to. So we could throw value error, for example. We might have to like, yeah, we might have to say something. I don't know exactly. I mean, or we could just return. You know, we could return. And if we just do return, do you remember what Python returns if we just
write the word return? None.
None, right?
It returns none, yes.
So unless we really need to throw an error, this is fine, right? So given what we've done here, so in this function now, we take in a table name and an ID, and based on this, if the type of the ID variable that they pass in is not equal to string, we say that the ID that of the record you provide must be a string value, right? And then we just return, we don't do anything else. And otherwise, if the table that they give us isn't a valid table name, we make them enter things until they give us a valid table name. And then and only then do we go and we do the rest of the stuff. And if we get to the end of this all, and then we don't actually get the record, but by this point, we know that the table name they've given us is good and the ID that they've given us has to be a string. Well, by the time we get there and we get to the bottom, then we can tell them that the record that they requested does not exist, right?
Yes, yes.
Does that make sense? So
yes, it does.
We could do more validation, we could do different validation, but this is at least some validation on most of the cases that we might want to handle here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete. We've had some sort of alternate ways that we could do this, you know, at various other points. So for example, down here, this was a different way than, you know, building a list and then using join on the list. This was us, you know, manually doing the concatenation and then removing the initial pipe. But, you know, this is fine. Just have it done one way. So it's easier for us to read here. All right. So that's our read record function. Now, when we want to add validation here to our, you remember, okay, this is from when we were talking about, did we want to do our table name validation inside the function, or did we want to do it every time we called the function, right? Do you remember that? And do you remember which one we decided on was better and why?
Yes, we preferred the one that doesn't have us calling the function every time or in this code every time.
Because if we do it in the function, then we just have to call the function and then it automatically gets repeated, right? Rather than making us copy paste stuff a bunch of times. So no, we don't want to do that. Okay. So that was read. Now let's come see what validation we want to do for delete. So guess what? Delete also has table name and ID. So do you think we basically want to copy the validation, right?
Yes.
In fact, let's see, can we copy the validation? Okay, so we're going to copy these and let's paste it and let's see if it makes sense. Okay, so Why do we have that print statement in there? Looks like you did start a little bit.
Yes, I did.
So here we're saying, again, we want to handle the same cases. We want to handle the case where the user passes in something other than a string for ID, right? Okay, so if the type of the ID is not equal to string is what we just did. And same thing with the table name here. We want to make sure that they give us a valid table name for whatever we're trying to delete, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, is there any way, how are we going to tell here if we never deleted a row? This one is trickier. I want you to sit here and think about this for a little bit.
Okay.
So up above, we were returning inside this. So if we got down here, implicitly, it meant that the record that we requested does not exist, right?
Yes.
So eventually in our delete function here, we want the line here so that the record to be deleted. The record 552. ID does not exist, something like that, right? But if we just stick this at the end of this function now, you see how this is going to run. This is going to run like whether or not. I didn't like that.
The deletion happens, right?
Yeah, whether or not we actually delete something, this is always going to print, right? Because we're going to get this line runs whether or not we deleted anything.
Okay. For row in ID and reader. So we could say after shell utility, the shell utility statement, we could say if ID equals row ID. Because after the deleting, the ID would still exist, wouldn't it? The ID would
I mean, I don't know exactly what you mean by that.
I mean, I want to use the ID. I want to use the value that would have been found in the dictionary for the ID. I want to use that to check to see if the records are still there after we have assumed that they're deleted. So it would be like doing this same line 155. We would just repeat it. If it's still there, then we say the record not deleted. And because
but after this shell utility call, do we still have the file open anymore?
Oh, right, we don't.
So if we just copy this, it's not going to work. What I'm saying. So I'll give you a hint here. I don't want us to get too stuck. What is basically, we are interested in a Boolean value, and what is the true or false value that we're interested in? Like, what does it represent conceptually? So we want to print this statement if what has happened.
If the deletion was successful.
Okay, so let's just start here by making a variable called deletion successful. Okay, successful. And we're going to set it equal to false. Okay. So we're just going to make a variable. We're going to call it deletion successful. And we're going to give it the value false. So when we go through here, we go through here, we go through here. if we succeed in deleting something, what do you think the value of this variable should become?
True.
Okay, and what does us succeeding to delete something, where in this code does that case happen?
After continue.
So if we put it after continue, that code will actually never be reached, right? Like if we were to put this right here, because continue makes us jump back up to the top of the loop, right?
Yes.
So if this only happens, in fact, it'll warn us here. It says local variable is assigned, but never, well, okay. So it's up here, but this code, you can take my word for it. It will never be possible to reach it, because if we hit this conditional, we're going to jump right back up to the top of the loop here. We're never going to execute this line. So this line actually needs to go before the continue here. And what we're saying is, if ID equals row ID, that means we found it. We found the ID, we found the row that we want to delete. And we're going to say, okay, we found it, good. That means the deletion is going to succeed. So we're going to set deletion successful equal to true. And then when we continue here, that means that we don't write the row back to the file. Us not doing this, that is implicitly what causes the deletion, right?
Yes.
But now we're going to go through all the other rows here. And because none of the other rows are going to match the ID, this variable that was initially false, but now we've set it to true, is going to stay true, right?
Yes.
And then down here, we can check if deletion successful. Only then do we print this message, right? Or if deletion, actually, I should say, if not deletion successful, right?
Okay. Okay.
In fact, having that not is very important, right? Because
yes.
If we left it just deletion successful, it would print this message anytime we did delete something, and then it would say that the ID that we tried to delete doesn't exist, which would be like the opposite of what we wanted to say, right?
Yeah. Okay. So what we're trying to do is to use it to the fact that we weren't able to delete something because that thing wasn't there to delete. Okay.
Now, very commonly with Boolean variables like this, you could name it one of two ways. So you see how we're negating this variable here? If you find that confusing, we could rename this variable to deletion failed, and we could set deletion failed equal to true initially. And then we could down here set the line deletion failed equals false. Because if deletion fails equals false, that means the deletion succeeded. And then we could set the conditional equal to, instead of deletion successful, we say deletion failed, right? Does it make sense what I just did? I just flipped the logic there. It really doesn't matter which way you do it, right? Much of the time, if you have a choice, you'll probably see people write it. This is usually called the so-called like forward logic direction, right? Where the conditional we check doesn't have a negation in it. Usually this direction is usually kind of easier to understand, right?
I think I understand it. In the beginning, what holds is that there is no deletion. It hasn't happened yet.
Right. That's why we said
Yes.
it's equal to deletion failed equals true here, because no deletion has happened yet.
Yes. But as soon as you find the ID, then deletion is going through. So you can say, well, it's the case. Now the deletion has happened. So deletion failed is no longer true. It's false. I get it. I get it.
So this is usually called a flag variable or a sentinel variable. You may hear it called either one of those things. So it's a Boolean variable, true and false. And what you use the variable for is you use it to flag the occurrence of something. And here, what we're tracking with this Boolean variable is if something happened. And the thing that we're tracking if it happened is whether or not we deleted the record.
Okay.
Does it make sense? The validation we've done on delete now. So now we're checking again, if the ID they pass in is a string, we want to make sure that, otherwise we get logic errors. Then we want to make sure that the table name that they're giving us is valid. So we just copy pasted the while loop here for the table name, right? And then finally, we want to make sure that the deletion actually happened. Okay, so now we've done read and delete. Let's do, what are the other ones? Update and create. Where's update? Looks like you commented it out at some point.
Oh, yeah. I think I was testing the other stuff.
Okay, so this is update, right? And what do we have for update? We have a table name and an ID again, right? Well, guess what? Table name and ID, right? So
yeah,
copy, paste, copy, paste. That's not too hard for us to add because we've already done that before, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So because we're not returning in the loop like we are with read, we're going to need to do a similar thing that we did down here for delete, right? We're going to need to track whether or not we've updated something, right?
Yeah.
So if I do this really quick, hopefully you can keep up. So we're going to start out by saying update failed, right? And then if we update it, well, it looks like you were, okay, good. You were adding some try except here, except this is actually isn't going to throw an error, but in the success case, if we do actually succeed, we're going to do the update here, and then we're going to say that update failed is going to be equal to false. After we do the update, we're going to set update failed equal to false. So this is exactly what we were just doing with delete, except now we're doing it for update. Makes sense? So we just copied what we just did with update instead.
Yeah. Okay. It's almost exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, this is what you had been trying to do when you first started this function, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to try to. Okay, yeah, we have issues here. So initially we had. Okay. You know what? Let me just be easier if we just start with this. So what we want to do is if the user tries to update the ID, we want to print a message, right? So now, do we actually have to get inside of a loop to check that though? Let me ask that. So we have the name of the field they want to update, and we have the new value of it right from the beginning of the function, right? So do we need to get all the way down here before we check if what they're trying to do is update ID?
Maybe not. Maybe not. I think we can check it right up there. That's what we did with which one was it? One of the functions we just checked.
I mean, we were checking if the type of ID was string, right? That's something we're doing right from the beginning. But for update, we actually have more than just the table name and the ID. We have these other fields as well.
Yeah.
So we said we don't want to let them update ID. So if the field that they give us, oops, must have caps on here. If the field that they give us is equal to ID, then you had an error message down here. We want to say, the ID field cannot be changed. Please choose another field, right?
Yes.
And at this point, because if they try to update this, the value that they give is not going to mean anything to us. We should probably just probably just return, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they try to update ID, we're going to tell them the ID field cannot be changed. Please choose another field, and then we're going to return. Okay. So now, do we need any of this stuff anymore?
We don't.
We still need the basic conditional though, because we need to know because we want to make sure that we're updating the right row, right?
Okay. Okay.
Like that. So they're giving us an ID, right? And we want to make sure that we are updating the value of the right row. So the row corresponding to the ID that we're passing into the update function. That's what this check does. And so if we're on that row, then we update the field on that row to equal the new value that we're passing in.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes, it does.
Now, I'm not going to have us do this. At some point, we might want to do validation to make sure that the data type of whatever field that they're passing in matches the value that they provided, right? So, for example, if they try to give a numerical value to a field that's a string, we'd probably want to let them know that. But that's going to be quite complicated, and we haven't even formally given things data types yet. So you know what? We're just not going to do that. So thus far, the cases that we have handled, though, for update. So we've handled the case where the ID that they give us is not a string, but it's a number. That's what this does. We handled the case that the table name they gave us isn't valid. That's what this does. We handled the case that they try to update the ID field. That's what this does, right? We say you can't change ID. ID is one of the ones that they can't control. And then finally, we let them know if they tried to update something, but the thing that they were trying to update didn't exist, right? So we're giving a lot more useful information now than we were before, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because before, if the function just failed, maybe it didn't work, but you didn't know why it didn't work, right? Now, hopefully, if it doesn't work, you kind of have an idea of why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So finally, we've done read, we've done update, we've done delete. We have to do create still here. Looks like you had started trying things on this one as well. So create has a table name, right? Okay. So we want to make sure that they are doing a valid table first. So this is the same thing that we've had before, right? So that's fine. So the other thing that we would want to check would be related to this value here, fields, right? So what happens if they try to add some things to a table, but the things that they provide to add like don't match the columns of the table? See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in fact, I'm going to pause on the rest of this one until you do one of the other functions that I had as an exercise. So you see this one right here, I said, check if the length of the list of values passed is the same as the length of the list for the table name. So ideally, we'd want to go through field by field and make sure that whatever they provided makes sense, right? But again, that's a level of complexity that I don't really want us to introduce right now, especially since Python doesn't really have data types in the same way that C# and Java do, for example. So for the time being, we're not going to do that. We're just going to check and make sure that the lengths are the same, right? That's an easy gut check. Am I passing in a list of values that's at least the same length as the values that I should be passing in, right? So that's what we're going to start with. We may come back later and do the actual value-based validation, but for now we can just check the lengths, right? And so that's what this function is going to do. We're going to have a dictionary here where we specify the tables and what their values are. That's what this dictionary represents, right? So the key is the table name. The values are the list of field names for that table. You see that? And so the function that you're going to be writing is going to be, we're going to check if the inputs that we give to this function for the given table name with the table dictionary specifying this information. Given all of that, we want to make sure that the input values that they give match the length of the data for that table. Does that make sense? So you're going to be writing this function before we next meet, and then we'll be able to use it here when we're trying to validate the create record table to make sure that the fields they pass in actually match the length for the fields that we're expecting for that table. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
but you're going to need to write that function first, and then we'll use that function when we validate create, right?
Okay.
So that is all of the things that I had planned for us to do today. So we got through the practice exercises that you had been working on. We did the ones that you had started at least. We decided we're going to leave the rest as practice problems here. And then we went through and we finished doing validation on all of the CRUD operations, except for that one bit of create, which we'll pick up with tomorrow after you've done the other practice problem. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to copy all of this stuff back in our Python file to just store it. We'll go ahead and put the practice problems back in the main Python file that we can run here. And this, I think, is where we'll cut off for today. And so before tomorrow, you can be working on these other 3 practice problems that we have here for authenticating someone and checking the input lengths like we just talked about, and then hashing a password. So that's where we'll cut for today. I'll come with more of a plan for tomorrow for what we do next, but I think we got quite a bit done today, and more practice incoming for you. So that's where we'll cut, and we will pick back up tomorrow.